Hello, my name is Phil, welcome back to the new Antioch Report. In today's video, I'm working on the next piece of my Cult of the Black Grail warband in this Plague Knight. Let's get into it. Using Nomad Sculpt, I had created some trench warfare bases, and I want to use this corrugated steel sheet stuck in the mud design. But unfortunately it's designed to work with multi-pose miniatures, and the Plague Knight is a monopose, so to start with I had to use some mini-putt to build up an area for the mini to have the back foot on, which will be covered up later on with basic material. After a prime of Army Painter Matte Black Primer, I started off with a thinned 50-50 paint to water mix of Scale 75 Metal and Alchemy Black Metal as a base for the armour. It's a much darker silver than others I use, and for the Forges of Hell I thought it more appropriate for a starting point. With that deeper, darker silver down, I want to build up some texture in the highlights. So start off with a stipple of a thinned 50-50 paint to water mix of Metal and Alchemy Thrash Metal, before moving on to a stipple of a brighter highlight in Metal and Alchemy Heavy Metal, again thinned down 50-50 paint to water. I wanted to separate out the sheet metal and the weapon from the armour, both being metal but giving it a different shade to break up the palette. For this, I used two thin coats Surcoats, then 50-50 paint to water over the corrugated steel and the weapon top. Continuing on with the bright work, it was on to the gold. I used the gold to accent the shoulder pads, as well as pick out the helmet details, plus the elbow pieces and leg accents. I used Scale 75 Metal and Alchemy Peridot Alchemy for this. I used it a lot in my videos, and the reason is I love the cold, more greeny yellow of the shade, rather than a warmer, more orange gold that you can use. I do use those warmer golds, but not really in Trench Crusade, as it doesn't fit the colder palette as much for me. With the metal work down, it was on to the wood for the handle of the pike. Starting off with Scale 75 red leather, then 50-50 paint to water to get the initial colour, before highlighting with a Scale 75 walnut, again thin 50-50, but this time dry brushed on to give it some more texture. Turning my attention back to the metal work, I started the weathering process, with some dirty down rust, thinned with water in a metal palette. The effect is water soluble, so it's very workable once applied, but also I found it works better when already thinned before applying, but you can use it neat if you want a really strong effect. The dirty down went over the areas of the armour and onto the sheet metal at the base, focusing more on the recesses and anywhere water would naturally run or pool, therefore giving the rest a more deliberate natural looking effect rather than over the top. Before going any further with the weathering on the metalwork, it was time to tackle the material hanging down the back. In a lot of the artwork and even the official pictures of painted knights, it's depicted as black cloth, but for me it reads much more as flayed flesh, which is also something more fitting to the Black Grail. I started off similar to how I started the heralds, which I painted in my last video, using a couple of thin coats 50-50 thinned paint to water Vallejo model colour deck tan, before applying a highlight of 50-50 paint to water thinned Vallejo game colour elfic flesh. Next, I used Villainy Inks Carrion Crimson enamel wash over the flesh to give it a stained bloody look. Thin 75-25 enamel to white spirit, it runs very well into the recesses and the particulates add to the mottled effect of the flesh. With the enamel fully cured, I continued with the filtering with some wet blending of a thin 75-25 paint to water Vallejo Express Demon Flesh and some neat Vallejo Game Colour Flesh Wash to add some purple and skin tones to the flesh. The result was a mottled disease look, which I was very happy with. With the base colour now complete, the weathering could really begin. First up was the old faithful AK Interactive Streak and Grime. This got applied all over the armour and the sheet metal as well as the wood and the pike, but leaving out the flesh. After waiting 15 minutes for the enamel to part cure, I used the reductive method of white spirit and cotton buds to take away the vast majority, leaving a thin filter over most of the model, with the recesses having a more of a heavy, grimier look to them. Going back to the flesh, I used a 50-50 enamel to white spirit thinned coat of Villainy Inks Decrepit Filth to grime them up, as this also has particulates in it, for more of a gritty look as well as a more black look to the filth than the brown that the streaking grind gives you. I also wanted it to be a more controlled application, which you can't really get with the reductive method alone, but I did use some clean white spirit and cotton buds to take away some of the wash in the raised areas that I didn't want to be too heavily covered. Bloodstains were up next, and for this I used Citadel Technical Blood for the Blood God, applied neat for the vibrancy but in small amounts in deliberate areas as an accent, like the weapon blades and the ripped holes in the flesh. To give the sheet metal a pop of colour and to stop it blending fully into the armour, I used Greenstuff World rust textures like Oxide Rust. Finally, it was onto the basing. I used my trusted AK Terrain's Muddy Ground to put up the No Man's Land mud and to hide the mini part used to get the right pose in the night. Tying it into the basing of the heralds, I also used some AK Swamp Water to start the water effects of that infected pooling look that the Lord of the Flies would heartily approve. I also used some AK Dry Mud splatter effect on the boots just to give them that muddy look and tie the base to the miniature. As it was starting to cure, I used some Citadel Abaddon Black to paint the rims of the bases before finally using some AK Puddle effects mixing into the swamp water to complete the look. I was extremely happy with how the Plague Knight came out in the end. The miniature is 90% metal armour, so it's easy to get lost in the silver, so using various elements of the gold and the flesh of the rear to break it up and create a much more interesting looking miniature was the goal, and I feel I was able to achieve that. As always, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to do all the usual things like, comment, share, subscribe and follow, and I'll see you all in the trenches.